The dryer thumped once, hard, like a fist inside steel. I froze with my hand on the counter key, staring at the row of machines as if they were animals that had learned how to stand still. The fluorescent lights hummed above me. The rain hammered the windows so steadily it sounded like static. And then, without warning, 3 different timers lit up at the exact same moment. 0045, 0045, 0045. No coins had dropped. No buttons had been pressed. The numbers glowed like they had always belonged there. I swallowed and listened. The empty building listened back. Then, one timer blinked off, blinked on, and reset itself like it had changed its mind. That was later. Earlier, the night was ordinary enough that I trusted it. The town had been a dot on the map until I signed the lease. Cheap rent, quiet streets, a place where the nights didn't have anything to do with me. That was the appeal. I'd told myself I needed a reset, somewhere I could work, sleep, repeat, somewhere my thoughts wouldn't echo so loudly. The laundromat was called Ridgeway Suds, the kind of name that tried to sound friendly. The sign outside buzzed and flickered when the rain came down hard, which it did a lot. Tonight, the rain had been falling since before sunset, a thick sheet that turned the parking lot into a shallow mirror. Inside, everything was bright and tired. Long rows of white machines, plastic chairs bolted to the floor, a corkboard with faded flyers, a vending machine that sold stale snacks. It made a soft electric whine when nobody touched it. Above it all, fluorescent lights that made skin look pale. They made the tile floors look too clean. I worked the overnight shift because it paid a little more, and because nobody wanted it. Most nights I saw 1 or 2 people at odd hours. Someone with a duffel bag, someone who smelled like cigarettes, someone who didn't talk. But heavy rain kept people home. When the weather sounded angry enough, the town went quiet like it was holding its breath. Tonight, the parking lot was empty. I unlocked the front door at 10, I turned on the big overhead lights, and I did the routine I had already memorized after a few weeks. I checked the change machine, I counted the quarters in the drawer, I wiped down the folding tables with lemon cleaner. It never quite covered the smell of detergent and wet fabric. Then I walked the rows and looked for anything left behind. Socks, dryer sheets, loose coins. People forget the smallest pieces of themselves here. Then I took my usual spot behind the counter. From there, I could see the whole room if I leaned a little. The rain kept drumming on the glass. The hum of the lights blended with the distant hiss of the soda machine. The building felt sealed off from the rest of the world, like a lit aquarium where nothing inside could survive long. I didn't mind the quiet at first. I had come here for quiet. I brought a paperback and a thermos of coffee. I scrolled on my phone. I listened to the rain. I watched the reflections slide across the windows when headlights passed on the road front. Around midnight, I stood up and walked the rows again out of habit, not because I needed to, but because sitting too long made my body feel like it didn't belong to me. The laundromat was so bright it sometimes felt unreal, like I was in a waiting room that never called my name. Everything was still. No washers sloshing, no dryers spinning, no customers. Just clean machines lined up like a promise. I remember thinking, this is what my life is now. Not in a sad way, not exactly. More like a statement I'd repeat until I believed it. I went back to the counter. I took a sip of coffee. I set the thermos down. That's when I heard it. A soft clink. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quick metallic sound that didn't match anything else in the room. I looked up. For a second, I thought the sound came from the change machine or the vending machine or the ceiling lights. My brain did what it always did. It grabbed the nearest normal explanation and tried to tape it over the weirdness. But then the clink came again, followed by a faint internal rattle. One of the washers, third from the left, had lit up. The little green display on its front panel glowed. The numbers flickered, then settled. 0030. My first thought was simple. Someone had come in and I hadn't heard the door. Maybe they were in the bathroom. Maybe they were crouched out of sight loading clothes into a machine. I stood quickly, my chair legs scraping on tile. I looked toward the door. The door was still locked from the inside like it always was at night. The glass panes showed nothing but rain and the empty lot beyond. No shadow, no shape. Then I glanced at the bathroom door at the back. It was closed, like always. Then I looked back at the washer. The machine sat there humming faintly, like a refrigerator, like something alive but asleep. The display held steady at 0030. The start button light was on. I walked toward it slowly, my shoes squeaking on tile. The room felt too big when I wasn't behind the counter. When I got close, I noticed something else. The coin slot hadn't taken anything. The little metal flap was still flush. No quarter jammed halfway in, no sticky residue. The coin return was empty. I leaned down and pressed my ear near the glass of the washer door. Nothing sloshing, no water, no clothes. Empty. My stomach did a small, tight shift, like it had dropped one stair. I straightened up and stared at the panel. Maybe I'd accidentally bumped something during my earlier walkthrough. Maybe the machine had a sensitive button. Maybe the rain was messing with the power and sending a little surge through the building. My brain kept offering explanations the way a person offers napkins at a spill. Quick fixes, keep the mess from spreading. I reached out and pressed cancel. The machine beeped, obedient. The green display blinked and went dark. I stood there for a moment longer, waiting for the hum to change, waiting for another sound, but nothing happened. Behind me, the rain kept tapping the windows. The fluorescent lights kept humming. The vending machine kept whining softly to itself. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Old wiring, I muttered, not because anyone was listening, but because the words made the explanation feel real. I walked back to the counter and sat down. For a while, I read a few pages of my book. I tried to let my attention sink into the story, to let my body settle back into routine, but my eyes kept lifting, tracking that row of machines like they might move when I wasn't looking. Nothing did. Minutes passed, maybe 20, maybe 30. I started to relax again. That's the thing about small, strange moments. Your mind tries to shrink them down so they fit inside the day, so they don't change the shape of everything. Then, from across the room, I heard a different sound. A click. I looked up. A dryer farther down the row had lit up. Just the display, a soft orange glow, a number appearing like it had always been there, 0045. I stared at it from behind the counter, my throat suddenly dry. I didn't move right away. I waited for the clink of a coin drop. No clink came. The timer sat there perfectly steady, as if someone had paid and walked away. I told myself the same thing again. Power surge, rain, old building. But my eyes flicked to the washer I'd canceled earlier, like I expected it to light up too. It stayed dark. The dryer's display held at 0045. I stood up slowly, feeling my own fatigue in the joints of my knees. I walked toward the dryer, keeping my steps measured, like the way you walk in a quiet room where someone is sleeping. When I got close, I put my hand on the dryer door. The metal was cool. I pulled. The door opened with a soft rubber sigh. The trum inside was empty, clean, still. I stared at the empty trum longer than made sense. Then I shut the door and pressed cancel. The dryer beeped once and went dark, the room instantly feeling brighter without that orange number. I stood there in the aisle between machines, listening. No footsteps, no door opening, no movement behind me. Just the rain, steady and heavy, and the faint distant traffic out on the road, like the world was passing by without noticing me. I started back to the counter, forcing myself not to rush. Halfway there, I glanced at the dryer again. It stayed dark. But the feeling didn't. The feeling was small, but it was new, like the first drop of cold water down your shirt, like the first moment you realize you might not be alone in a place that's supposed to be empty. When I sat down behind the counter again, I didn't open my book. I just watched the rows of machines and listened to the rain. And every time the lights hummed a little louder, I found myself staring at the displays, waiting for a number to appear. The next few nights passed without anything unusual that almost bothered me more than if something had happened again. The rain came and went the way it always did. The parking lot stayed mostly empty after midnight. The fluorescent lights hummed. The vending machine whined. The buildings stayed sealed and bright and quiet, like a glass box floating in the dark. I kept waiting for another timer to light up. It didn't. I told myself that meant I'd been right the first time. Power surge, old wiring, moisture in the walls, a tired brain looking for something to latch onto during a long shift. Still, I found myself watching the machines more than my book. My eyes kept drifting to the displays, the coin slots, the doors, the buttons. I caught myself counting how many were dark, how many reflected light differently, how many had faint smudges on the glass. I started doing extra walkthroughs, not because anything needed fixing, but because moving made the space feel less like it was pressing in on me. I told myself it was nothing. Then, 3 nights later, the pattern began. It was quieter than the first time. No clink, no click, just a soft electronic wake-up sound, like a breath being taken in. I noticed it because the light shifted. One dryer near the far wall glowed faintly orange. 0045. The same number. I stayed seated behind the counter this time. I didn't jump up, I didn't rush. I just watched it like you watch a reflection that doesn't quite match your movement. I waited for the sound of coins. Nothing. I waited for the door to open. Nothing. The parking lot outside was empty except for rain rippling in puddles. I stood after a few seconds and walked toward the dryer. The door was cool. The drum was empty. The coin slot untouched. I canceled it. The display went dark. I stood there longer than necessary, listening. Nothing else changed. I went back to the counter, my chest feeling tight in a way I couldn't explain. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. 2 nights later, it happened again. Different machine, same number. Then, again the night after that. Always one machine, never 2 at once. Always when the laundromat was empty. Always without the sound of a coin. I started writing the dates down on a scrap of receipt paper, not because I thought it meant anything, just because my brain wanted something solid to hold on to. Monday, dryer near the back wall. Wednesday, washer in the middle row. Friday, dryer closest to the vending machine. The times weren't consistent. Sometimes it happened closer to midnight, sometimes closer to 2 in the morning. But the number was always the same, 0045. I began to notice other small things too. A washer door that felt warmer than it should have been, even though it hadn't run. A faint vibration under my shoes when no machines were active. A soft hum that lingered a second longer than the lights. Each time I told myself it was normal. Buildings made noise, machines retained heat, electricity carried momentum. My body was tired, my mind was bored. Still, my routine shifted without me really deciding to change it. I stopped sitting with my back to the machines. I started positioning my chair so I could see all displays at once. I began taking my breaks closer to the counter instead of walking to the far folding tables. I began listening more than reading. The silence in the laundromat wasn't empty anymore. It felt layered, like something thin was laid over it, barely noticeable unless you focused too hard. One night while wiping down a table, I noticed a dryer door slightly ajar, just an inch. I stood there, cloth in hand, staring at it. I was almost certain I'd closed every door during my last walkthrough. It was part of the habit. Open doors looked sloppy. They invited dust. I walked over and pulled it fully open. Inside the drum was a single sock. Gray, thin, worn at the heel. I didn't recognize it. I held it between my fingers, feeling the faint warmth still trapped in the fabric. Not hot, just recently warm. My first thought was that a customer had left it behind earlier and I'd missed it, but the dryer hadn't been running. I would have heard it. I checked the lint trap. Clean. I checked the other machines nearby. Empty. I stood there holding the sock longer than made sense, then carried it to the lost and found bin near the counter. I wrote "gray sock" on a sticky note and dropped it in. That night, 2 machines lit up, not at the same time, one after the other. Both showed 0045. I canceled both. My heart didn't race, not exactly, but my body felt alert in a way that made it hard to sit still. I slept poorly the next day. My dreams were shallow, crowded with light and humming and numbers that kept resetting themselves. I started coming into work a little early, just to walk the rows and reassure myself everything was quiet. The sock stayed in the lost and found bin for days. No one claimed it. Then, one night, I found a second sock. Same gray, same worn heel. This one was inside a different dryer. I stood in the aisle holding both socks, one in each hand, staring at the empty drums around me. My chest felt tight again. I didn't like the idea of matching anything. I put the second sock into the bin and folded them both neatly, like giving them structure would make them harmless. That night, a washer timer reset itself while I was standing only a few feet away. I heard the faint electronic beep. I watched the display blink off, then blink on. 0045. I didn't touch it right away. I stood there, staring at the glowing numbers, listening to the rain and the hum and the distant traffic. I felt like the room was waiting for me to react. After a few seconds, I canceled it. The display went dark. The hum continued. But the feeling stayed. I began checking every machine before sitting down, opening doors, running my hands along the edges of the panels, looking for moisture, loose wiring, anything that would give me something concrete to blame. I found nothing. The pattern continued, every few nights, always the same number. Sometimes a washer, sometimes a dryer, occasionally a forgotten piece of clothing appearing where nothing had been before. Nothing dramatic, nothing I could prove to anyone, just repetition, just quiet insistence. I stopped telling myself it was coincidence, not out loud, not fully, but somewhere in the back of my mind, something had shifted, like a door had cracked open and refused to close again. One night, while standing behind the counter, I realized I'd started counting time differently, not by the clock on the wall, by the spaces between the disturbances. 3 nights, 2 nights, 4 nights. My body leaned forward slightly when the room went too still. My ears strained when the hum changed pitch. My eyes flicked to the displays without me meaning to. I was learning the laundromat the way you learn a breathing pattern when you sleep next to someone. I didn't like that thought. I didn't like how familiar it felt. Late one night, after canceling another phantom cycle, I stood in the center of the room and slowly turned in a circle. Every machine was dark, every door closed. The rain pressed against the windows in steady sheets. The parking lot reflected the fluorescent lights like a pale lake. Everything looked normal, too normal. And for the first time since I'd started this job, the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt occupied. The laundromat began to feel smaller. Not physically. The rows of machines were still spaced the same. The ceiling was still high enough to swallow sound. The windows still showed the same stretch of empty asphalt and blurred headlights in the rain. But the air felt closer to my skin, like the room was leaning in. I noticed it most when I stopped moving. When I stood still behind the counter, the hum of the lights seemed louder. When I leaned against a folding table, the faint vibration in the floor felt more noticeable. When I paused in the aisle between machines, the silence thickened, like something waiting for the next sound to break it. I started staying on my feet more often. Sitting made me feel exposed. I told myself it was just nerves, that once your brain learns to look for something, it kept finding it everywhere, the same way you suddenly notice a word everywhere after hearing it once. Still, my body didn't listen. I began locking the bathroom door after checking it, even though no one was ever inside. I double-checked the front door lock more than once per shift. I kept my keys clipped to my belt instead of setting them on the counter. Small things, quiet things, the kind of habits that grow without permission. The machines kept their pattern. Every few nights, one of them would wake itself up. Sometimes it happened while I was in the back wiping the sink, sometimes while I was standing at the vending machine, sometimes while I was directly facing the rows. Always the same soft electronic breath, always the same glow, always 00:45. I canceled them quickly now, faster than before, like letting them sit lit for too long might encourage something else to happen. I stopped writing the dates down. I didn't want proof anymore. I wanted the nights to blur together again. One evening, during a heavy storm that rattled the windows harder than usual, I found a damp hoodie inside a dryer. Not soaked, just lightly wet, like it had been left in mist. It smelled faintly of detergent and rain. I stood there holding it, the fabric cool against my palms, listening to the thunder roll somewhere far off beyond the town. No one had come in that night. I was certain of it. I'd watched the door. I'd listened for footsteps. I'd heard nothing but weather and humming. I folded the hoodie and placed it into the lost and found bin without labeling it. I didn't want to read the words later. That same night, 2 washers reset themselves within 10 minutes of each other. The second one happened while I was still standing beside the first. I watched the numbers blink. Off. On. 00:45. My skin prickled. For the first time, the thought slipped in uninvited. It's paying attention. I didn't like that sentence. I didn't repeat it. But it lingered anyway, floating somewhere behind my eyes. The isolation started pressing harder. Friends back home texted less. My schedule didn't line up with anyone's daytime life. Most mornings I went to sleep while the rest of the town was waking up. Most evenings I woke up while the light outside was already fading. My world narrowed to fluorescent light and rain and humming metal. Sometimes, when I walked to my car after a shift, the quiet street felt louder than the laundromat. I found myself lingering inside longer than necessary. Like stepping into the dark parking lot felt like leaving shelter. That scared me more than the machines. One night, while restocking detergent packets behind the counter, I heard the unmistakable thump of a dryer starting. Not the display, the drum. A slow rotation sound, fabric brushing metal. I froze. Every hair on my arms lifted. I moved slowly into the aisle, my heartbeat loud in my ears. The dryer halfway down the row was turning. The door was closed. The display read 00:45. I stood there watching the glass circle rotate, expecting to see clothing tumble. The drum was empty. No fabric, no shadow, just smooth metal spinning quietly in the bright room. I walked closer, my steps careful, my breath shallow. I pressed my hand against the dryer door. I felt the vibration, real, present. I opened it. The drum coasted to a stop. The display blinked off. The room returned to stillness so suddenly it made my ears ring. I stood there with my hand still on the handle, my stomach tight and cold. After that night, I stopped leaning against machines. I stopped standing between rows. I kept myself closer to the counter, closer to the exit, even though the door was locked. Sleep became thin and unreliable. I dreamed of glowing numbers in dark rooms. I dreamed of standing in the laundromat while the lights slowly dimmed one by one, until only the machine displays remained. I started drinking more coffee than was reasonable. My hands sometimes shook when I poured it. Another thing changed. The machines started responding closer to me. Not always, but enough that I noticed. One night, a washer lit up while I was standing directly in front of it. Another time, a dryer reset while I was walking past its row. Once, a timer blinked on while my hand hovered inches from the button panel of the next machine over. Each time, the timing felt wrong, too precise, too aware. I stopped touching the machines unless I had to. I used the end of a pen to press cancel buttons. I avoided leaning over open doors. I kept space between my body and the metal whenever possible. The laundromat felt less like a workplace and more like a narrow corridor, a corridor I had to pass through each night without brushing the walls. The lost and found bin slowly filled with small things: a glove, a thin scarf, a child's sock. None of them smelled old. None of them looked dusty. All of them felt like they had arrived recently. I stopped opening the bin. I didn't want to touch anything else that didn't belong. Late one shift, while mopping near the back wall, the lights flickered briefly. Just a half-second dip, enough to make my eyes blink. When the lights stabilized, 3 machine displays were lit at once, all showing 00:45. My breath caught in my throat. That had never happened before. I stood frozen, the mop handle clenched in my hands, listening to the hum deepen slightly under the added electrical load. The numbers glowed steady. No sound of coins, no movement, just light. I canceled the nearest one, then the next, then the third. My hands were shaking by the time the room returned to full darkness. I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes for a moment, counting slow breaths. In, out, in, out. When I opened my eyes again, the room looked exactly the same as it always had. Bright, clean, quiet. But something in me had crossed a line. I could feel it. The unease was no longer mild. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was vigilance. It was the constant sense of being measured by something that never blinked. As my shift crept toward morning, I found myself standing near the counter, eyes fixed on the dark machines, waiting. Not for a sound, not for light, for a mistake. For the moment the pattern would finally break in a way I couldn't smooth over. And the waiting itself began to feel like part of whatever was happening. I stopped pretending I could ignore it, not in a dramatic way. There was no moment where I slammed my hand on the counter or said anything out loud. It was quieter than that. Just a slow acceptance that the pattern wasn't going to fade on its own. If anything, it felt like it was tightening. The machines had begun responding closer to me. The lost and found bin had filled with things that hadn't passed through the front door. The timers no longer waited patiently for empty moments. They appeared while I was moving, while I was watching. The space between cause and effect felt thinner. So one night, after canceling another phantom cycle, I didn't walk away. I stayed there in the aisle. The display had just gone dark. The hum of the room settled back into its familiar baseline. The rain pressed steadily against the windows. I waited, not with a plan, not with confidence, just with a strange need to see what happened if I didn't retreat. My body felt rigid, every muscle lightly tense. My breathing stayed shallow, like I was afraid of making too much sound in a place that was already listening too closely. Nothing happened. 10 seconds passed, then 20. I started to feel foolish. I took a slow step forward, closer to the row of washers. The lights didn't flicker. No displays lit up. No hidden motors stirred. I exhaled and felt some of the tension leak out of my shoulders. That was when I noticed the door. One of the washers, second from the end, was slightly open, just enough to break the clean line of the row. I was almost certain it had been closed moments earlier. I approached it slowly. The rubber seal was cool under my fingers when I pulled the door open the rest of the way. Inside the drums sat a small pile of clothes, folded. Not neatly stacked, not carefully arranged, but intentionally placed. A shirt draped over a pair of jeans, a thin towel folded once and laid across the top. They were damp, not dripping, just cool and recently wet. I stared at them, my mouth dry, my heart beating slow and heavy in my chest. I hadn't seen anyone come in. I hadn't heard the door. I hadn't heard the machine run. The room around me felt very quiet. I lifted the shirt. It was warm in the center, like it had just come out of a dryer that didn't exist. I set it back gently, like the clothes might react to being disturbed. My eyes drifted to the washer display. It was dark. No numbers. No glow. I straightened slowly and looked around the laundromat. Every other machine was dark. The doors were closed. The lost and found bin sat untouched near the counter. The rain streaked the windows in pale lines. Nothing in the room acknowledged what I was holding. I carried the clothes to the folding table. I laid them out carefully. They didn't match each other. Different fabrics, different sizes, nothing I recognized. My fingers tingled faintly after touching them, like I'd held something cold for too long. I stood there for a long moment, unsure what I was supposed to do next. There was no one to call, no rule for this, no procedure for clothes that appeared already warm. I folded them and placed them in the lost and found bin without labeling them. The bin was nearly full now. I stepped back and looked at it. A quiet collection of small, ordinary things that shouldn't have been here. Something about that made my chest tighten. I went back to the center of the room and waited again. The waiting felt different now, more intentional, like I was stepping into the rhythm instead of skirting around it. The hum of the lights seemed louder. The faint vibration under the floor seemed steadier. The rain sounded farther away than it should have been. After several minutes, one dryer display lit up, not near me, across the room. 00:45. I didn't move. I watched it glow. The numbers stayed steady. No coin sound, no door movement, just light. I waited. Another dryer lit up, same number. Then a washer. 3 machines, all glowing softly in the bright room. My pulse picked up, a slow thudding behind my ribs. I stayed where I was, forcing my hands to remain open at my sides instead of clenching. The hum deepened slightly, like the building drawing a longer breath. The numbers didn't change. I felt a strange pressure behind my eyes, like the urge to look away and the urge to stare were fighting each other. Then, slowly, the nearest washer display blinked. Off. On. 00:45. Again. It reset itself while already running. My stomach tightened. The second display followed. Off. On. 00:45. Then the third. The rhythm was deliberate, measured, like something testing the timing. I took one cautious step forward. The nearest machine's display went dark. Instantly, I stopped. The other 2 stayed lit. I took another small step. The second display flickered and went dark. I froze. The last display remained lit across the room, glowing faintly like a distant signal. The room felt charged, not with electricity exactly, with attention. I took one more step. The final display blinked off. The laundromat returned to full stillness.
The hum leveled out, the vibration faded, the rain reclaimed the soundscape. I stood there, breathing shallowly, my skin prickling with something that felt dangerously close to recognition. It felt like the room had been tracking me, not visually, not consciously, but through proximity, through presence, through the simple fact of where I was standing. The realization didn't come as a thought, it came as a physical reaction, a coldness spreading slowly through my arms. I backed away towards the counter, careful, measured, like retreating from something that didn't like sudden movement. Nothing followed, nothing changed, but the sense of being aligned with something invisible stayed with me. I didn't try to test it again that night. I kept my distance from the machines. I stayed behind the counter until my shift ended. When morning finally arrived and the rain softened into mist, the laundromat looked harmless again, clean, bright, ordinary. But the memory of the displays reacting to my steps clung to me like static. I knew something about the pattern had shifted. It wasn't just repeating anymore, it was responding.
It stopped. Not suddenly, not with any clear ending, just a gradual absence that took me a few nights to notice. The machine stayed dark. No displays lit up on their own, no quiet electronic breaths, no phantom cycles waiting for me to cancel them. The laundromat returned to its old, predictable rhythm of hum and rain and empty space. At first, I didn't trust it. I kept expecting the numbers to appear again the moment I relaxed. I kept standing slightly angled so I could see every row at once. I kept my keys clipped tight to my belt. I kept listening for sounds that weren't there. Nothing happened. 3 nights passed, then 5, then a full week. The lost and found bin stayed full, but nothing new appeared. The scattered gloves and socks and damp fabric didn't multiply. They just sat there, quiet and ordinary and strangely heavy with presence. Eventually, I forced myself to empty it. I told myself it was part of my job, that letting it sit was just feeding the same vigilance that had been exhausting me for weeks. I folded the items carefully and sealed them in a clear bag for donation pickup. As I worked, I kept noticing how normal they felt in my hands. Just fabric, just weight, just ordinary forgotten things. When the bin was empty again, the corner of the laundromat looked wrong. Too clean, too open, like something had been erased without leaving a mark behind. I tried to let that feeling go. My sleep improved slowly. The dreams faded. The tight buzzing behind my eyes loosened. My coffee intake dropped back to something reasonable. My hands stopped trembling when I poured it. I started reading again during slow hours instead of scanning the machines. I even caught myself leaning against a washer one night, before realizing what I was doing and stepping away with a small laugh at my own nerves. The rain kept coming and going. The nights stayed empty. The hum stayed constant. Everything looked normal, almost. One evening, as I finished my routine walkthrough near the start of my shift, I paused beside a dryer and rested my hand on the metal door without thinking. The surface felt slightly warm, not hot, just faintly warmer than the air around it. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, listening. No display was lit. No vibration moved through the metal. The room stayed quiet. I told myself it was residual heat from the day shift, that the building held warmth the way it held sound, that I was still too sensitive to small sensations. I moved on. Later that night, while wiping down the folding tables, I noticed one of the chairs had shifted slightly out of alignment, just a few inches, like someone had nudged it with their knee and forgotten to push it back in. I stared at it longer than made sense, then straightened it and kept cleaning. I told myself chairs moved, people bumped things, air shifted when doors opened and closed, even if I hadn't heard the door. Near 3 in the morning, as the rain softened into a fine mist outside, I stood behind the counter and watched the reflections slide across the glass. Headlights passed on the road. The fluorescent lights hummed softly. The vending machine clicked and settled into silence. The laundromat felt peaceful in a way it hadn't for a long time. My shoulders loosened, my breathing slowed. I let the quiet settle around me instead of pressing against it.
That's when I noticed the clock on the wall. It read 2:14 a.m. I watched the second hand move. One tick, another. I wasn't waiting for anything. I wasn't listening for any sound. I wasn't watching the machines. The second hand clicked forward again. 2:15 a.m. Something about the number sat oddly in my chest. Not fear, not alarm, just a faint sense of recognition that didn't have a clear source. I shook it off and looked back down at my book. A few minutes later, I glanced up again. The clock now read 3:00 a.m. I frowned. That wasn't possible. I hadn't lost 45 minutes. I hadn't been asleep. The room hadn't changed.
The rain outside still misted the windows in the same soft pattern. The hum of the lights hadn't shifted. I stared at the clock, my heart beginning to beat a little faster. The second hand was moving normally. I checked my phone. 3:00 a.m. The time matched. No missed alerts, no drained battery, no sign of a glitch. Just a missing stretch of time that hadn't left any impression behind. My mouth felt dry. I scanned the laundromat instinctively. Every machine was dark. Every door was closed. The lost and found bin was empty. The chairs were aligned. The floor was clean. Nothing looked disturbed. I stood there for several seconds, trying to replay the last hour in my head. There was nothing there. No memory of reading. No memory of standing. No memory of anything between 2:15 and 3:00. Just blankness. The quiet didn't feel heavy. It didn't feel occupied. It felt smooth, too smooth, like a surface that had been carefully wiped clean. I swallowed and slowly sat back down behind the counter. I told myself people lose track of time all the time, that fatigue did strange things to perception, that my body was still adjusting to a normal rhythm after weeks of tension. I told myself that nothing had happened. The rest of the shift passed without incident. Morning arrived. Sunlight softened the edges of the windows. The rain faded into damp air and pale clouds. I locked up and walked to my car feeling tired but steady. The town looked exactly the same as it always had. Normal, predictable, safe. That night, when I returned for another shift, the laundromat greeted me with the same bright lights and quiet hum. The machines stayed dark. The rain tapped gently against the glass. The parking lot reflected the fluorescent glow. Everything looked right. I took my place behind the counter and opened my book. A few minutes later, without thinking, I glanced at the wall clock. It read 11:14 p.m. I felt a small tightening in my chest. I looked away. I didn't check it again. The hum continued. The rain whispered against the windows. The machines waited silently. And somewhere in the space between 1 minute and the next, something very small and very patient seemed to be counting.